to our speaker, colleagues, and participant. I welcome you all on behalf of Eco India. Eco India, in collaboration with SBI Foundation, is running a series of webinars on COVID 19 education components, and experts from across India are giving us information to deal with the crisis. Today, we are in the ninth webinar of the series. The nation has hit by a devastating second wave with more than 3.2 lakh deaths. In past 24 hours, India has recorded 1.73 lakh new COVID cases, and which is the lowest in last 45 days. But there is a discussion about the third wave striking very soon. Today's session is on COVID diagnosis and treatment, and it will bring you more information which is needed during today's time for by all of us. I would like to invite Dr. Sandeep Bhalla, Associate Vice President at Eco India, to formally start the session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Deepa, and very warm welcome to all my senior medical colleagues, all healthcare professionals from different nooks and corners of our country, those who have joined. Today, if you see that these last few weeks, they have been amongst the most harrowing and desperate for all of us in India as we have been battling with the deadly second wave of COVID. However, driven by a steady increase in testing, drop in case positivity, and a rising recovery rate, most of the states reported a decline in active cases since last week. Accordingly, the data from the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare underlining that the ebbing of second wave is reassuring. We have already started talking about the discussion, as my colleague has also mentioned, about the third wave striking soon. Currently, the active caseload of the COVID-19 stands at 24.2 lakhs after a reduction of 35% from 37.4 lakh active cases. Though the improvement is significant, a positivity rate of more than 10% is a cause of concern in some of the states so far, and efforts are needed to ensure that it falls below 5%. And high caseload states like Maharashtra, Kerala, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu remains on a declining path of infections even after lockdowns are eased. Another good sign is that daily cases have not breached the 3 lakhs mark since May 17. Thursday, we saw the highest daily vaccination level in India also. India's COVID-19 death toll climbed to 3,18,000, which is number 3 in the world now after US and Brazil. The active cases further reduced to 23,43,000, comprising of 8.5% of total infections. With the national COVID-19 recovery rate has improved to 90%, more than 90%. As India battles the huge crisis, we at Eco India Extension for Community Health Outcomes organization deeply value the role of educational this webinar series, which we started almost a month now, and today we are in the ninth session of the series. The aim of this educational webinar series is to address the concerns on prevention, transmission, and clinical management, and various aspects. Just sharing with the recent news, just 3 hours before the ICMR has released, the scientists of National Environmental Engineering Research Institute, NERI, have developed a do-it-yourself saline gargle RT-PCR test for testing COVID-19 samples. The instant, comfortable, and patient-friendly testing method will generate the results within 3 hours. This has been approved by ICMR. This is a non-invasive and so simple that a patient can collect the sample himself. Today, to take our journey further, I have none other than but a very eminent faculty, national faculty from Thane, with whom I have been attached since more than a decade now, and he is none other than but Dr. Vijay Neglur. Dr. Neglur is the director of Renuka Hospital for Advanced Diabetes Care since last 35 years. He is also the director of Dr. Neglur's Diabetes Specialty Center, Thane, consultant diabetologist at Jupiter Hospital, and my initiation started at Jupiter Hospital, Thane. That was my first introduction in 2010. He's the president of Neglur's Academy of Diabetes and Research, teaching faculty of diabetology at College of Physicians, Surgeons, and PHFR. Founder member of Association of Diabetes Educators in India. President of ADCP, that is Association of Diabetes Care and Prevention, and Chairman Scientific Committee RSSPI 2012, which has held in Mumbai. Today, sir is going to take us to a new initiative that is COVID-19 diagnosis and management. I think this is a very, very hot topic and multiple things have been changed since 2020 March when we started getting the COVID cases in a big way. Though the first case started in Wuhan in December, but lot of changes have happened in the science in the COVID diagnosis and management protocols. So I will hand it over now to Dr. Vijay Neglu, sir, to take it over to update us about this new initiative or new things which have come in diagnosis and management. Over to you, sir. Thank you. I think in the meantime, he would join us. I just want to share with you that this educational series which we have started, we started with the support of SBI Foundation, which has given us an educational support to run this particular series. As the supply-demand discrepancy continues to loom on India's vaccination efforts, states ask the center to procure more vaccines. A lot of things have started in the vaccination arena also. And I think sir has joined. I will hand it over to him to take it over to this particular topic. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Bhalla, for your very kind words of introduction. Thank you, Paramita. Thank you, Deepa, for this kind introduction. And of course, the opportunity to share my thought on the pandemic COVID. My slides, I think, are visible.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, okay. So this is what you see on your slide is in the screen is the picture from the wet market. Way back 18 months ago, the first case, which was started from Wuhan, had the exposure to this wet market. It was believed that the virus fell off from the bat and to pangolin, and the entire world is caught in the midst of this grip of a COVID since last 17 months. The impact was so much that we have 168 million cases worldwide and 3.5 million deaths till last week. And interestingly, on 24th of May, the World Health Assembly and the Chinese organization met on the concept of deciding what could be the possible cause or the origin of the disease, whether it's a zoonotic disease, meaning the infection has spilled over from the animals to human being, from the wet market, or is it a leak from the laboratory, is what is going to be a big discussion. Nicholas Wade, all of you know, last week wrote a big article and what are the possible causes, how this virus came out of Wuhan, whether it's a wet market or whether it's a laboratory, is a point to be worth consider. And as the evidence comes along, it will get more and more clarity. Suffice to say now that it is this market which was the first case from where the infection began. This is the dashboard of the Johns Hopkins Hospital, mentions also about India. And what is classically seen is the number of cases, number of deaths, and number of people taken vaccination. As Dr. Bhalla was saying, that we have roughly about 10 to 11% of the people have taken the vaccine. As compared to US, it's almost 50%, Brazil 18.5%, Israel 100%. So therefore, we need to vaccine large number of people. And if we can have the 70% of the population vaccinated, then we can get good herd immunity and we might prevent the disease, like we could prevent many diseases like smallpox and so on, and rabies and so on and so forth. So we need to give this kind of vaccination to at least 70% of the Indian population. Once we can do that, probably we have achieved a great success. This is again from Wuhan, which I showed you wet market earlier, very unknown case of the pneumonias were getting admitted in last week of December in 2019. And these patients were admitted, which was turned suddenly very serious, and most of them could not survive. And therefore, in 31st of December in 2019, the Chinese Center for Disease Control dispatched a response team to Wuhan to conduct epidemiological and etiological investigation. It was Dr. Li Willingham, 34 years old, young ophthalmic surgeon, was the first person to blow whistle about the pandemic or epidemic, which is going to be there in China, with large number of people are dying. And Dr. A. Fin, who was actually director of emergency department, was responsible for identification of the virus from the bronchoaspal lavage, and the lower respiratory tract samples. And that's how this birth of the virus causing this very peculiar disease, producing pneumonia and having high mortality, was brought to surface by almost first week of January. And most of the patients who admitted at those times has the symptoms which appear 2 to 14 days, which is actually incubation period of the virus. And then they present with symptoms like headache, congestion, and the running of the nose, and loss of taste and smell. Cough and sore throat was a pretty common complaint of fatigue, body pain, and fever and chills, shortness of breath. And with the symptoms of shortness of breath, the admission to ICU was very rapid. And from the ICU, most of the patients could not survive those times because it was difficult to make a diagnosis. And the relentless progress of the disease was such that it was difficult to help the patient to live. And some of them had a GI manifestation by nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. The skin manifestations also are described in the COVID infection, but these manifestations are pretty commonly seen in Europeans and the American population, not much common in the Asian population, out of which pseudochilblain is the most important manifestation that you can see on the feet here, where there's something like you're exposed to very cold weather, how you get the feet, because there's no exposure to cold, that's why it's called pseudochilblain. And these manifestations could be either immunological response to the virus, or it could be just the infection itself by the virus, we still don't know. But all the time, we know that it's much less common in the Asian population, especially in India. Could be because of dark skin, but then this was commonly reported from that particular part of the country. And of course, many young boys presented like this strawberry kind of tongue, which is also manifested as reported from New York studies. And some people had this maculopapular rash also on the extensor surface of the arms. So these are some of the manifestations which are not very common in our population. Pregnancy also the important cause for because we all know the pregnancy is the impaired immune response. And what actually happened during those periods, the pregnant ladies who got COVID infection, and there the symptomatology was very similar. And we had about 420 cases from China, 76 from Europe, and 42 from Europe, and 76 from USA. And all of them really had required serious disease, critical disease, ICU admissions were quite small that way compared to 538 patients. And patients who required ICU also had required mechanical ventilation, but the mortality was not high. And furthermore, there was no transmission of the disease from the mother to the child. There was no vertical transmission of the disease. Interestingly, despite of the close proximity to the child from the mother, it was not seen to have been transmitted in the baby. There are some extrapulmonary manifestation of the COVID-19 infection, which may present to begin with or may return after some time after the patient is okay, or patient is literally asymptomatic, or sometimes they last for quite some time. So these are the manifestations which are unpredictable. The entire virus is predictably unpredictable. So therefore, everything what we see, we discuss is quite unpredictable. As I mentioned to you, some dermat manifestation, the cardiac manifestation also like myocardial injury, toxotubocardiomyopathy, which is commonly seen in female with acute stress, arrhythmias because of myocarditis, cardiac shock, and the endocrine manifestation like severe hyperglycemia. A lot of patients presented for the first time with a ketoacidosis. So they did not have diabetes to begin with, or those who were diabetics suddenly became very hyperglycemic, required a severe hyperglycemia requiring admission to the hospital. GI manifestation, as I told you earlier, were also described to begin with, like diarrhea, vomiting, nausea, loss of taste was also there. Neurological manifestations classically the delayed manifest that we saw in patients of COVID. When they recovered and went home, they had manifest like headache, dizziness, encephalopathy was a manifestation in the ward, in the ICU. Some of them presented the Guillain-Barré disease, as I mentioned already, egugeusia. Thromboembolic manifestation was the major cause of the mortality, and which produced deep vein thrombosis, pulmonary embolism, and catheter thrombosis. Plus, of course, there was a lot of thrombosis in the vascular bed, especially the pulmonary bed, producing hypoxia, requiring ventilation or high flow oxygen. The hepatic manifestation was seen as elevated of liver enzymes and also bilirubin, and the renal manifestation like acute kidney injury, proteinuria, hematuria were also seen. In other words, every organ, every system was affected in the COVID manifestation. There were multiple ways in which the patient presented to the hospital, requiring attention almost of all the specialists that were in the hospital. There's a lot of speculation about the way the disease was transmitted from human to human. It was believed it was because of the contact of droplet of more than 5 micron in the diameter. Therefore, we required to have, we said about social distancing, which we said that distance should be at least 6 feet or 1 meter, because that's the way the 5 micron diameter can be transmitted. But there's also now a kind of airborne transmission which can occur. Suppose you're staying in a closed room or ill-ventilated room, or sometimes in a restaurant or in a pub where everything is closed, where less than 5 microns can come as aerosol form, and there it can remain in suspended air for quite some time. You can get infection even if you maintain a distance more than 1 meter. So therefore, there are various modes of transmission of the disease. Besides the droplet infection, there's also aerosol infection, aerosol mode of transmission to cause infection. Of course, the urine and feces, the RNA was found in both, and the live virus cultivated from the few specimens. We do not know whether there's also a kind of a transmission existed there. Also, though the speculation was there earlier, but there was no proof as of now today whether we have transmission by this route. It suffices to say today that it is the airborne transmission, usually by the droplet, and of course the aerosol, which has a micron size of less than 5. And the fomites, which you can see here classically, the stainless steel in the plastic is the one which can hold on the virus for a long time, almost as long as 6 hours. You can see the virus is on the steel board or on the plastic, which can again up to 6 to 8 hours. So therefore, we're using a mobile phone, which has a plastic cover, which is a stainless steel body. The virus can remain on your watch or on the mobile phone. If you're touched with that, then it can stay on 6 to 8 hours. So remember that these fomites also should be taken care of when you consider the mode of transmission of disease. That brings us to the lab evaluation of a patient. And of course, the leukopenia is the hallmark of the disease, where the 25% of patients show less amount of leukopenia and lymphopenia, but lymphocytes are much less compared to the neutrophil that you see here. And here the lymphocyte count goes down almost 63% of the patient. And here the invasion of the CD147, that's lymphocytes, is slightly different from what you see in HIV virus. In HIV virus, as the virus gets into lymphocytes, it makes the machinery of the lymphocytes to produce more amount of the virus of the HIV. But in contradistinction to that, the virus of the COVID, which enters the lymphocytes, crowds in the lymphocytes and reduces the lymphocyte number, but doesn't make the lymphocyte to replicate the virus. That's a different from the HIV virus, though it's similar in terms of invading the lymphocytes. So lymphocytes count go down. So therefore, we have a very important ratio called neutrophil lymphocyte ratio. If it's more than 3.13, which suggests that there is a kind of a high severe disease, especially in people who are above 50 years of age. There's also increased levels of the transaminases in about 40% of the patient. Plus, we have a lot of biomarkers like LDH, ferritin, procalcitonin, prothrombin time, and D-dimer, interleukin-6 are all quite elevated. A lot of people keep on monitoring this frequently, but I think it is not important to keep on monitoring these biomarkers, but always see the patient clinically and decide the treatment rather than being guided by the biomarkers, because biomarkers have been now misused and been studied, and more often, so much so the laboratories are loaded with the work of doing all these biomarkers. There can also increase levels of hypersensitive troponin T in substantially in patients who have a cardiac injury because of virus. So that has also been described, especially from Wuhan. The chest CT is also a kind of a hallmark feature, which has shown the bilateral peripheral ground glass opacity, which you see along with consolidation. And this picture seen in 6 to 11 days time. Nowadays, the trend of all the general practitioners to send the patients on day one for the CT scan evaluation. Please don't do that because it picks up after 6 days to 11 days. Do not hurry up and send the patient for a CT scan. And I personally believe that value of CT scan in evaluation of patient is not that much as the laboratories are loaded, or the CT scan centers are loaded with patients. And there's also exposure to the radiation, and also a non-positive patient is also exposed to the machine, which cannot be disinfected because this has been used rampantly to evaluate the patients of COVID infection. And in Wuhan, it was found out the sensitivity is 97%, but the specificity is 25%. Mark, this is important. And sometimes it can be positive ahead of RT-PCR. It's possible that before RT-PCR becomes positive, the picture can be seen, but the specificity is definitely less. So 60% to 93% patients had initial positive lung consistent COVID before the initial positive CT. And you can see on the CT scan, the bilateral peripheral ground glass appearance that you can see. You can see also consolidation. And based on this, there is also scoring system, and the scoring system can be highest up to 12 and lowest can be up to 0. So there can be a scoring system which is based by the CT findings. And actually, to my mind, it is not very important to find the scoring system, because the treatment or the decision to change the medicine is not based on the CT scan picture. I want to repeat this because I think it is overused modality of treatment of the management of the patients of COVID. Now, the nucleic acid testing of SARS-CoV-2, as for the Infectious Disease Society of America, is important that when you have a high suspicion of COVID and if a test becomes negative, whether it's non-hospitalized or hospitalized patient, it is imperative that you repeat the test, because it's possible that the collection may be faulty and you may not have collected the specimen rightly. So it's possible even in the hospitalized setting or a non-hospitalized setting, if the test is negative in a high suspicion patients, please repeat the test again. But in patients where the suspicion is much less, there is no need to repeat the test again. And therefore, this amplification testing, the collection of the nasopharyngeal antenasal turbinate, bit turbinate is the most important site from which you should collect. Saliva or the combined nasal oropharyngeal specimen should be collected. Quite often, many patients are very sensitive, they are gag sensitive. So any instrumentation in the nose or the pharynx, the people really shun it away. And therefore, the specimen collection becomes difficult. So therefore, the person who collects should be well trained and should take care of himself and collect the proper specimen so the yield is good. So this is how you have a nucleic acid testing, which tells you about the current infections. And we have the RT-PCR kits available. The false negative test can be because of improper sampling or improper handling of the sample, or the patient has a low viral load, or there can be mutations which cannot be picked up. But of course, we have the kits available where you can pick up the mutation that's available today. And this cannot be detected by day 14. So by 14th day, if you do the test, more often than not, the test will be negative. We have a serologic test also, which tells you about the past infection, because this picks up the antibodies, and this tells you about the infection itself. So this is like looking at the virus itself, the causative agent, but here this is the antibodies. I personally believe that doing the antibody test, which have been, a lot of people do this test of IgG, IgM and all, I feel it's only for the academic interest. It gives you no information, and one should not indulge in doing all these tests. It's important that the collection should be right, and the test positivity is pretty high in the first 10 days. This is a sample collected from the Hong Kong hospital. 23 numbers are small, and therefore viral loads are highest during the first week following the symptom. Remember that whether you collect it from the endotracheal tube, whether you take it from the saliva or the pharynx, the yield is highest in the first 10 days, the first week, and therefore the diagnostic tests are to be done when the load is highest so that the yield is good. So the first 1 week after with the symptom, the yield is pretty high. This is the temporal consideration for diagnosis. As we can see here, the red line shows about the virus itself. And the yellow line shows from the stool PCR, which is the slowest one. And you can see the IgG, IgM antibodies, which begin somewhere between first week and the second week when the virus isolation becomes negative. At that time, the antibody response starts. And interestingly here, we have both IgG, IgM almost start simultaneously here. Normally, the IgM comes first and the IgG later. But very interesting, it was found out in the COVID infection that both the antibodies come together. And you can see here that keeps on climbing till the week 3. And as you advance ahead, the IgM becomes negative and IgG continues to remain positive, at least for a period of 3 months. This is important because I feel that where the facility for RT-PCR is not available, the PCR antigen testing can be very useful. Because once you get the exposure to the virus, within the first week of symptom, you get the antigen test positive. So this is a simple test which requires just 15 minutes. And if this test comes out with positive, you may not do RT-PCR, which again remains positive for almost 4 weeks here, but first 10 days, as I told you, it will remain positive. So you can see here the graph very clearly that the RT-PCR can remain positive and the facility is not available. This antigen test can be done quickly within 15 minutes. So this is how the antigen test works. This is the sample. You need to take the sample again from the nasopharyngeal area, and you can see this is the control line and this is the test line. So both lines should come positive, and that means the test is positive. If only the control line positive and the test line is negative, then the test is negative. And only test line comes positive and the control is negative, that means the test is improper. So therefore, this is a mixed solution you apply here, and within 15 minutes you get the report. So that's again what is shown here, the antigen kit. The antibody kit requires again a blood sample. Remember how it's different from the antigen kit, which is nasopharyngeal, which does not require to collect the blood sample, and RT-PCR is also nasopharyngeal. The sensitivity is quite low compared to the RT-PCR, but if it's positive, I think within 15 minutes, you can get the diagnosis, you can isolate the person, you can immediately start giving medication or direct him properly to the proper center where he can get proper medications. That's very important of doing the antigens, especially when the resources are limited. So therefore, the NIH guideline decides about the COVID infection clinically to be divided into 3 groups: the mild illness, the moderate illness, and the severe illness, and the critical illness. So this is how the 4 divisions clinically. It's very important to analyze the patient clinically. And what you see here, these patients have varied symptoms, for example, fever, cough, sore throat, malaise, headache, muscle pain, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, loss of taste and smell. All that I told you earlier are the symptoms. These patients are very comfortable. They have no shortness of breath, no dyspnea, or no abnormal chest imaging if you decide to do it. But I personally believe we should not do chest imaging even in these patients. Just to observe them very carefully, give them very symptomatic treatment, assure them, and isolate them. The moderate illness, when the SpO2 is still above 94, but the patients have lower respiratory disease, and it's evidenced by the clinical assessment or by imaging, these patients can also be managed at home. And now with the problems of availability of the bed, the oxygen, and everything, the entire medical facilities have collapsed because of the second wave. So this has become difficult. So these patients even can manage at home. The severe illness is when the SpO2 sinks below 94 and the PaO2, FiO2 below 300. And these patients respirate more than 30 and their lung infiltrates more than 50%. These patients require ICU admission, and critical illness patients are beyond this and they require respiratory support because of respiratory failure, there's septic shock, and a multi-organ dysfunction. These are the critical patients. 80% of your patients will be in mild or a moderate illness. 20% will be in severe illness and critical illness. Only 2 to 5% of the patient will require the respiratory assistance or the cardiovascular assistance. And these are the really sick and ill patients. So small percent of the patient becomes sick or ill. The large number of patients can get all right with the domiciliary treatment. So it's important to assess this and understand this important aspect. and therefore give the advice accordingly. The most important predictor of the mortality among the COVID patient is the age. As you advance in the age, the mortality keeps on rising. The hazard ratio goes on from 2-fold to 4-fold to 11-fold. If you are a person with more than 80 years of the age, you can see that the hazard ratio is almost 11-fold for him to have a bad outcome. So therefore, it's important that the older patients, especially men, and the chronic comorbid condition, for example, diabetes, obesity, chronic neurological disorder, dementia, malignancy, are the people who have a poor outcome. So these patients have to focus properly when you give attention to the people with the COVID infection. And we all know we witnessed this second wave, and this wave has put the India out of gear. It has put the standstill to the nation to a grinding halt, and you can see number of cases have increased because the number of tests become more, and a lot of patients getting admitted in the hospital getting overflowed, and bringing on the second lockdown phase in the country. And we also see from Chhattisgarh, Karnataka, and all over India, and the many possible explanations were given, and that could be this COVID appropriate behavior. You can see large number of crowding people not wearing masks, going to the market. This Kumbh Mela, which occurred in the northern India. And also these are the people waiting for the vaccine. Remember, these are the people waiting for vaccine. So a lot of people felt they got the infection because they're waiting for the vaccination in long queues. So when it comes to management of these patients, obviously the prevention is the most important aspect. We know the prevention is better than cure. And here we see the CDC tells us that you maintain at least 6 feet distance, wash hands very frequently, especially with soap, because the soap contains the oleic acid, which can destroy the lipid layer on the lipid layer coat of the virus, and therefore can help to disinfect your hands. Also, you can use the various solutions available like ethanol, hydrogen peroxide, sodium hydrochloride, whatever you want to use, but the soap and water is the best way to disinfect, and wash frequently, and frequent touch surfaces, especially the mobile phones, the plastic covers, the stainless steel, the tabletops need to be frequently cleaned, especially when you have large number of people coming, especially in your clinic or especially in hospital. On the table, you need to do this. Face masks are very important. You may wear a N95 mask, which can take care of the microns of the less than 3 microns of the size. Up to 3 micron size particles cannot pass these masks, so therefore they're good for the healthcare workers. Use 95 masks because we have little shortage of masks, and therefore you can reuse them after 1 week, keeping them in the hot sun, and that can be used. You need to follow the etiquettes of the sneezing, and you sneeze in your arms, not in your hands, because you can touch your hands and face again. The elbow bump is also important. As I mentioned to you earlier, washing hands with the soap is the most important way of preventing the spread of the disease from one person to another. These, if they followed very well, I think like taking vaccination or equivalent to taking vaccination. So therefore, this is to be, I don't think we should overemphasize this. This is well known, well understood, well taught, but not well followed. So therefore, the non-therapeutic management I mentioned to you earlier, in the mild COVID patients, you require isolation. Even for some example, even a moderate group of patients require isolation. It can be home, or it can be a facility where you can keep these patients away and treat only symptoms. If you treat the symptoms well, then these patients may not require large amount of drug that we use, especially we use indiscriminately the antibiotics, steroids are indiscriminately used. We are paying the price for that. We can see the black fungus growing, and that's because of unscrupulous use of steroids. And therefore, symptomatic treatment, I think NSAIDs give a good relief to these patients, and the patient doesn't ask for any more treatment. So therefore, it's important to treat them symptomatically, treat them well, hydrate them well, and give them a good nutrition. And if the patient is diabetic, control their blood sugar extremely well. Educate the patient about the pandemic, how the virus spreads, how to protect, use of the face mask, and isolation has to be taught to the patient as per WHO. And the same is echoed by National Institute of Health in UK. And they also believe the same thing. No imaging or specific lab test is indicated, otherwise healthy. Majority of the cases can manage at home, use telemedicine to tell them. Close monitoring is very essential. And in hospital, in a non-hospitalized patient, do not initiate anticoagulants, antiplatelet therapy to prevent thromboembolism. So therefore, it's very important that you have a masterly inactivity, but monitor the patient very closely. And if we can do that, I think we can nip this disease in its bud itself, not allowing it to progress further. Now, the key therapeutic drugs are plenty of them, but I want to tell you that the appropriate management therapies for patients with COVID-19 are rapidly evolving. What you say today may not be true tomorrow, and what you say tomorrow may not be true the day after. So it's rapidly evolving, and a therapeutic challenge and the optimal agent, if any, to treat infection or prevent progression to critical illness remain ill-defined. So we still do not know what is the right drug in a right patient. So it's very important that we are also evolving. We're learning this disease. We're also on the learning curve, and a lot of us have to understand this. The first thing that we should understand that the disease has the three phases of progression. The first is the early infection, when the patient presents with the mild symptoms of fever and a dry cough, which may last for about a week or so. And here, the lymphopenia is the only manifest that you see here. And here, these patients can be best managed with the symptomatic treatment. The disease progresses to what is called the pulmonary stage or pulmonary phase, in which we have the shortness of breath as a manifestation with the hypoxia, when the SpO2 may remain below 94. And these patients have abnormal chest imaging, and there can be transaminases, or there can be low procalcitonin, PCT can be low. Here, the drug can be used, remdesivir. Remember, remdesivir is a very, very short window of therapy. It is very effective in this short period of time. If you use early, if you late, it's of no use. And as the disease progresses, you have the host inflammatory response setting in, which produces hyperinflammatory phase, where the patient has the acute respiratory distress syndrome. There can be shock, there can be cardiac failure. And here the inflammatory biomarkers, there can be high CRP, high LDH, interleukin-6, D-dimer, where the role of dexamethasone and oxygen. Oxygen also is possibly here. So when those patients who require oxygen in the early stage are benefited with remdesivir. Those who do not require oxygen, probably remdesivir has no beneficial role. So remdesivir also is trying to find a disease where it can be treated. We began with Ebola virus, then we hepatitis C. Now we are thinking in patients of COVID disease. So this is what is important, that the benefit is only demonstrated only in these areas. The other places, the benefit is unclear. One must appreciate this, because then the treatment is very meaningful and very, very effective. Now, this is how the most of drugs work. This is the coronavirus you can see here, and it's docking on this ACE protein. I want to highlight with you this TMPRSS2, which is also again a transmembrane protein of the serine protease family. This is also increased in patients of COVID infection, and this receptor is also driven to some extent by the androgens. So that's the reason why the men are more affected than the females, because this is driven entirely by the androgens, which is lacking in women. And that's why the COVID infections are pretty stronger, or having the heavy impact, hits hard to men rather than women. That's one reason why it's possible. And very interestingly, the drugs that we use routinely for a cough mixture, like bromhexine, is known to inhibit this TMPRSS2. So then again, a trial being conducted. It's also useful for influenza virus as well. So therefore, if you can inhibit this virus, then you will become similar to women. And so therefore, the impact of the disease can be less. So there's work going on in this aspect, where bromhexine can be of any use. So let's important is the Infection Disease Society says that this treatment is okay. What is it okay? That it recommends hospitalized with critically COVID-19 patients dexamethasone use, not otherwise. When the patient is not critically ill, any Tom, Dick, Harry with COVID infection, do not use steroids. Dexamethasone is not to be given. Patients with hospitalized with severe COVID disease, again, dexamethasone. Dexamethasone was used in UK probably because it was easily available that time. That's why dexamethasone was given used in that trial, recovery trial, come that a little later. And those patients with progressive severe critical illness, tocilizumab can be used with standard care of life, standard care of treatment. And patients with hospitalized with severe COVID infection, remdesivir can be used. Ambulatory at high risk for severe disease, you can use the monoclonal antibodies, bamlanivimab, or the estivimab, or the combination also will be launched soon by Eli Lilly. And hospital with severe COVID disease, you can use the JAK inhibitor, baricitinib, and remdesivir combination or remdesivir alone. Recommends only in clinical trials. Convalescent plasma, again, finds no role in treatment today. And the baricitinib, remdesivir plus steroids in the hospitalized with the COVID-19 infection. So therefore, there are very few drugs that we can use it. And what it says against, do not use this medication. Hydroxychloroquine, no role to play at all. Patient hospitalized COVID, hydroxychloroquine, azithromycin, do not use. Lopinavir, ritonavir, no use. Balminab, monotherapy, hospitalized severe, no use. Hospitalized non-severe disease, glucocorticoids, do not use it. Hospitalized COVID-19, routine remdesivir, do not use it. Unless there's hypoxia, do not use it. Suggest against the outside clinical trial, famotidine, ivermectin, no role to play at all. So therefore, there are a lot of drugs which have not been used or they've been told not to use. That brings me to this very important trial by WHO called Solidarity Trial, which had 11,000 patients and multiple arms like remdesivir arm, hydroxychloroquine arm, lopinavir, ritonavir, which we use it for HIV infection, interferon beta-1 alpha subcutaneously on 3 occasions, and a standard of care with overlapping groups. What did we find? This is what we found, that remdesivir with the standard of care did not show any improvement in Solidarity Trial, no improvement on 28-day mortality for patients treated with remdesivir, or hydroxychloroquine was worse. It worsened, increased the mortality in the Solidarity Trial. Remember that it did not show any benefit. And you can see here with lopinavir, ritonavir, the standard of care, the difference was there, but not significant statistically. And interferon beta-1 alpha, again, not shown significant statistically. So therefore, none of these drugs, remdesivir, hydroxychloroquine, lopinavir, ritonavir, interferon beta-1 alpha, not effective. Ivermectin was again a drug which was, again, it's antiparasitic drugs. It has been shown to have some effect in the culture, in vitro. In vivo, of course, there's a mixed results. But as of now, the NIH, the National Institute of Health COVID-19 treatment guideline panel says there are insufficient data to recommend either for or against the use of ivermectin for the treatment of COVID-19. So most of the studies had incomplete information and significant methodology was limitation. So this is the February 11, 2021 update saying that the ivermectin is of no use. FabiFlu is again launched in India, approved in India for treatment of COVID-19. It is a huge drug, 1,800 milligram twice daily for 1 day, first day, and then for 14 days, 4 tablets twice a day. But there's only one study of 150 patients. There's no randomized controlled trial. The adverse event of lymphopenia was seen in patients who use the drug versus the patients of control, that is 8%, 36%, and the pill burden and the expense, to my mind, is not a right drug for patients of COVID infection. This is an interesting study, which is the use of budesonide, which we normally use for patients of bronchial asthma. People above 65 years were used in the study, which is a multi-center open label trial. 50 years with the comorbid condition like diabetes, hypertension, where you don't want to give oral steroid to these patients within 14 days of symptoms. You can give them this inhalation or this particular nebulizer, which gives them the drug budesonide. So 751 patients with budesonide, 1028 usual care, and 643 were other interventions. What did you see? That the recovery by this drug was 3 days earlier compared to the other drugs, and the hospitalization and death was 8.5% in budesonide compared to 10.3% in the other care group. So it's significant. So I feel those patients who are 50 plus or 65, we don't want to use steroids, this could be a good drug, but remember, use within 14 days, and this drug has shown to be effective, so it can be used again. This is a very important trial called recovery trial, and the principal investigator called Martin Landry, who did this trial, looking at a large number of patients, and patients were more than 18 years of age, and they were all kinds of arms, lopinavir, ritonavir, dexamethasone, hydroxychloroquine, azithromycin, all were there. So therefore, there are more than 38,799 patients from 177 active sites from UK. And what did they see? Here what they say was the patients who used dexamethasone compared to usual care was benefited, okay, in the amount 6,400 patients. But if you look at those patients who did not require oxygen, were admitted, when they get dexamethasone, they fared badly. In fact, the risk increased by 19%. So therefore, those patients who are admitted in the hospital, who are not given oxygen, this drug is not to be used. Remember, not to be used in those patients who do not require oxygen. And those patients who require oxygen, of course, the oxygen-only therapy, among 3,000 patients plus, the dexamethasone showed improvement, and that was significant statistically. It showed 18% reduction in the mortality. So the mortality reduction was seen for the first time in the COVID infection by using steroid in those patients who required oxygen therapy. And those who required mechanical ventilation, 1,000 patients, the benefit was 36%. So 36% reduction was seen in the mortality in patients who are ventilated. So message is loud and clear that those patients who are oxygen, those patients on mechanical ventilation are the only one who did extremely well. So remdesivir is the next drug, which we know is a nucleoside analog, which blocks the RNA-dependent RNA polymerase and therefore prevents the replication of the virus. The therapeutic indications are for patients who are COVID-19 adults above the age of 12 years, weighing 40 kilograms, and those who require supplemental oxygen. So this is the narrow indication of using remdesivir for patients. I see people lining up in front of the pharmacy for waiting for remdesivir. It is not a great panacea that we should worry about. This is the dose that we give about 12 years, more than 40 kg. They're loading this 1,200 milligrams on day 1, and then 100 milligrams from day to 2 to 10, either 10 days or 5 days therapy based on the decision. And be careful that people who are low GFR, increased prothrombin time, and hepatic lab abnormalities patient should not be given. There can be also profound bradycardia when you give this drug to the patient in the hospital. And this is the study which is called the ACT-1 study, which looked at remdesivir in 200 milligram loading dose, 100 milligrams from day 2 to day 10, and the placebo. And these are the patients who are above 18 years of age, and they had the SpO2 of less than 94. Remember, these are the patients who are hypoxic, requiring supplementary oxygen. Remember, it's very important, supplementary oxygen is required to these patients. And what did you find? That the primary recovery point was very great, and these patients did well. And this, what did it show was that the patient of recovery time, the remdesivir required 10 days to get all right. It took 15 days for placebo. That was significant statistically, but there was no mortality benefit. There was no benefit in mortality. It was 6.0 versus 11.9. So therefore, this drug did not show any improvement in mortality, but it showed improvement in the survival period of time. If you can see again the sub-analysis, you can see those patients who require oxygen, high flow oxygen or mechanical ventilation, it did not show any benefit. So it's only those patients who require oxygen initially, or those receiving oxygen are the only one who showed the benefit with remdesivir, and also the Asians also showed some kind of a better response to the remdesivir medication. That brings us to next molecule, that is the passive immunization, which I've been doing for many infections. We are doing for rabies. We're giving hyperimmune serum to these patients. So similarly, we can have monoclonal antibodies, which are produced in laboratory. which can be scalable, and the genetic information from the FC domain can induce the risk of adverse event and extend half-life. We can have hyperimmune immunoglobulins from plasma and convalescent plasma, which are 3 modes of therapy we have here. And this is the convalescent plasma, where you take up the neutralizing antibodies from the blood and you infuse them to the patient, and the patient gets benefit. Again, here, the most important study which is done from China, which looked at 103 patients all, and severe disease and life-threatening disease, there is no improvement at all. And therefore, the message again is that there is insufficient data to recommend either or against the use of convalescent plasma, which has not shown any beneficial effect at all. That brings us to next monoclonal antibody called bamlanivimab. These are the very tongue twister words. The ends with mab, that is monoclonal antibodies. And here also that 700 milligrams was recommended, should be given in 60 to 60 minutes. These are the patients we should be given within 10 days. And these are non-hospitalized patients. Remember, non-hospitalized, not very ill patient, very beginning of the treatment. And this is supposed to improve the patient's hospitalized benefit. Patients on chronic oxygen therapy are not at all indicated. So therefore, this is a very, very early therapy that you can use. And now we have the combination. And what the good news is, the India is launching this molecule of casirivimab along with imdevimab, which is 1200 milligrams, which cost about close to 60,000 rupees per patient. And the Cipla is going to distribute this drug. Donald Trump, you can see here, was the first recipient of this experimental therapy, and his cocktail of 2 antibodies directed against 2 subunits of the spike protein S1 and S2. And it is shown that it is, it's within 10 days of symptoms should be given. There is no recommended dose adjustment for the pregnant, lactating women, patients with renal impairment. This is maybe kind of a promise for patients where you can prevent admission, and you can use it especially for patients who are obese, patients who have got chronic kidney disease, patients who have got diabetes, age more than 65 years, and those who are less than 65 with diabetes, hypertension, chronic obstructive airway disease, chronic lung disease, and currently taking immunosuppressive therapy. This is a subset of patients where this could be effective. That brings us to the JAK2 inhibitors. These are again molecules which are now used in rheumatology for patients of rheumatoid arthritis or juvenile idiopathic arthritis, where these are the signaling molecules. These are the STAT molecules. When the dimerization occurs after stimulation by the molecule or the cytokine, these 2 STAT molecules are released from the subbinding sites, and they go to the nucleus and brings about transcription factor. This can be blocked, and therefore Janus inhibitor was used in rheumatoid arthritis. Now, with this drug cannot be or should not be used without remdesivir. So it's a combination with remdesivir and Bari. I'm using it as short form as a Bari in 1,000 odd patients, and it showed the recovery time with Bari was 10 days compared to 18 days in the standard group, but there was no impact on the mortality. So this again, new molecules are coming up. Tocilizumab is the molecule which has been used in various diseases, also in rheumatology. It's the humanized monoclonal antibody. You can see here that this is the soluble IL-6 receptors, and you can get antibodies here. Look at the antibodies getting bound to receptors. The competitively blocks the interaction, and they used in treatment of rheumatoid arthritis and juvenile idiopathic arthritis, used also in the acute cytokine response in patients who are undergoing CAR-T. Risk of serious infection. Remember, in elderly patients, especially in India with tuberculosis, is a possible cause, and this can exacerbate these infections like pneumonia, cellulitis, sepsis. It's very important that your WBC count is very high and you have done the procalcitonin levels are pretty high. You should not use this drug because this drug can worsen all the infections, and that's very important limitation. So this is a trial which looked at tocilizumab along with placebo in 377 patients, and it showed that tocilizumab had 19.3% of the primary not requiring ventilation compared to 12% in the standard arm at the end of 28 days. The hazard ratio is very significant, almost 44%. And there's no difference in time hospital discharge, time to improvement in clinical status, time to clinical failure, incidence of infection or mortality. The single dose, or sometimes you can repeat the dose. but it did not show the outcome next day. And interleukin-6 levels are being measured quite routinely. In fact, when you give I6 interleukin-6 inhibitor, there can be a transient rise of interleukin-6 interleukin-6 levels. Now, this is the guideline, which is not truly the ICMR guideline, nor the WHO guideline, not the guideline by the infectious disease American Society, but this is what I made a cocktail and made it very simple. So patients would divide into 3 groups. Those with respiratory less than 24, oxygen saturation more than 90, right? Stay at home, check oxygen, give symptomatic treatment, you can give betamethasone, nothing else. Just observe them. Do not start dexamethasone, very important. Those with 24 and 30 rate and oxygen less than 90, you need to admit them in the hospital. Again, it's important that you make them sleep in a prone position, because it's been shown by sleeping in a prone position, the oxygenation is much better. This was the observation done by R.P. Mellins, who was a respiratory physiotherapist, who realized that patients of cystic fibrosis children sleep prone and they have less hypoxia. So therefore, sleep prone, very important, simple thing to do. You can do CBC D-dimer, CRP, and if the oxygen levels are low, you can give dexamethasone. The 6 milligrams is what is advised in UK. We give 8 milligrams, and that can be okay. Just once a day for 10 days. Don't extend beyond 10 days. It's just 10 days and just 10 days, not beyond that. Remember, very important. And those patients are serious. And here you can consider remdesivir if the oxygen leaving less. But this is not mentioned in the guidelines, but the Indian guidelines do mention remdesivir, and they also do mention ivermectin. The patients with respiratory more than 30, saturation less than 85%, these patients require ICU admission. You have to give them oxygen. You can give them a high flow oxygen so that you maintain the oxygen beyond 90. You need to give them again proning. Then here again, you can give dexamethasone, 6 milligrams. If the patient is worsening with 6 or 8 milligrams in 5 days, you can upscale the treatment of dexamethasone, though it is not been a standard practice, but you can do it. Or you can use tocilizumab, that can be used in this, or tocilizumab can be used here. Or age 60 years with diabetes, you must increase the respiratory support in these patients. So this is roughly how you treat patients. And remember, the drug utilization is very, very selected. You need to use the anticoagulants, especially NOACs, like rivaroxaban or LMWH or unfractionated heparin, depending on the availability of that. And for dexamethasone, the alternative can be prednisolone, hydrocortisone, and methylprednisolone. In India, or the Indian guidelines mentioned about methylprednisolone, and dexamethasone is one which has come from recovery trial. As I told you, dexamethasone was advised in those patients because that was available easily there. So these are life-saving medications. Oxygen, steroids, and proning may be useful. Tocilizumab, remdesivir, plasma, baricitinib, budesonide. The not useful are vitamins and zinc, which are flooded in the patient's treatment prescription, and harmful are these drugs. Remember, these drugs, if used like fluoxamine, azithromycin, doxycycline, favipiravir, lopinavir, can be harmful in some patients. That brings us to neat problem that occurred in patients of COVID, which has worsening of coagulopathy. We didn't realize why the hypoxia was due to. And that's probably because of the endothelitis this patient had. And because of the endothelial involvement, because endothelium is loaded with the ACE2 receptors. And because of the endothelial injury, there was activation of von Willebrand factor, and that brought about thrombotic episodes and factor X11 activation and thrombin to fibrin conversion. And that is because of the endothelial dysfunction, bringing the altered blood flow. And that has brought the hypoxia. That is how we realize that these patients may not do better with ventilation, but they will do better with thromboprophylaxis. And therefore, this was what recommended for all patients who are admitted in ICU. They should be given a low molecular heparin, or they can give NOAC. The fondaparinux is the drug which is recommended, especially because if the patient has heparin-induced thrombocytopenia. So that was what recommended. Now from the frying pan to fire, The mucormycosis came in a big way. This is my friend Rajiv Soman, who has written this article along with Aisha Sunawala. She's in Bombay. And this is the India being diabetes and mucormycosis capital. So they become the twin epidemic or syndemic because of these two diseases coming together. And diabetes made the perfect recipe for the disaster. So the high spore count, everybody, all of us inhale this. There's hyperglycemia, excess of free iron, thromboinflammation, improper immune response, immune exhaustion, and immune suppression made this kind of attitude for develop this disease. And the doctors licensed to disuse or misuse steroids with the cavalier, nothing happens if I give steroid attitude is the unfortunate reality written by Rajiv Soman. And here we have this COT3 receptor, which is on the hyphae of the mucor, which has the receptors on the endothelium, which gets upregulated because of the endoplasmic reticulum stress due to high glucose and high free iron and diabetic ketoacidosis. Remember, in the acidotic media, the fungus grows extremely well. And that's why this fungus has brought all kinds of invasion. And we have all this kind of therapy available. Today's discussion doesn't permit me to go in details, but remember that amphotericin B is a choice, that drug that you use it. And this drug to be continued for till such time the patient is totally cleared of infection. The other drugs which are now available, posaconazole, isavuconazole, are also drugs available, but because of the shortage of amphotericin B, many patients are now using posaconazole, isavuconazole. But remember, this is a very, very opportunistic infection which requires the surgical debridement as the most important way of managing these patients. Some of the patients who remain symptomatic for quite some time, they're called long haulers. This is the study from Italy, where patients continue to have fatigue, dyspnea, joint pain, and these patients continue to have this kind of symptom for almost 3 months. And most of these patients also reported a poor quality of life. All that it requires is the assurance, because a lot of people have the fear that they might get infected again with COVID. And a lot of people also have neurological sequelae. They had the psychotic sequelae, Parkinson, dementia, depression, anxiety, and all kinds of problems they had, either because of the infection itself or because of lockdown, loss of job, and of course, many other factors contributed. Reinfection for COVID infection is possible, but the duration and robustness of immunity of SARS-CoV-2 remains under investigation, and therefore we have to have symptoms of 90 days after the infection, which may consider reinfection. But this is, the CDC says that the case of reinfection COVID-19 have been reported, but remain quite rare. So remember, it's possible, but it's quite rare. Talking of fatality rate because of COVID infection, the overall fatality was 2.3%, but if comorbid condition like diabetes, it became 7.3%. The cerebrovascular disease, the cardiovascular disease, 10%. So more and more comorbid conditions, the fatality increase. People ask me this question, how long this virus is going to stay? And this is the prediction from CIDRAP, which is Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy from Minnesota, which tells us that there can be peaks and valleys, there can be fall and peak or slow burnout. So we can expect the disease can linger around till 2022 January. There's one more year we have to go through with infection. But remember to use the mask, keep a social distancing, and wash hands very carefully. So the last part of my talk is the vaccines, and we have to, besides flattening the curve of the infection, we have to flatten the IQ of the people, saying that the virus is a hoax, is created by left-wing politicians. COVID-19 isn't a bad at all. Everyone is overreacting. Wear a mask, how stupid it is. A lot of people are reacting to this, probably because of the inappropriate attitude towards the COVID infection. These are the various platforms available, the viral vector, the DNA, RNA, protein, and the kill attenuated vaccine. We have today in India the viral vector, which is the AstraZeneca Covishield, and with the killed attenuated virus, which is by the Bharat Biotech, which is the Covaxin. There are 2 vaccines available in India. And actually the development of vaccine takes 10 to 15 years. But because of the pandemic, the vaccine development pathway is rapidly progressed, and therefore we have got vaccine in less than a year time after the virus was isolated somewhere in the month of January last year. And we have a Covishield or Covaxin vaccine. There are many more platforms which will be soon available, which can be a Zydus vaccine, which can be Sputnik, which is I think available. And we have the other more vaccines which will be soon available in this country. So there will be no more shortage of vaccines. The peculiar thing happened with the vaccine, especially in the European part of the nation where they're given the AstraZeneca vaccine. It was brought by Manika Pai, who was working in the, she's working in the McMaster University in Canada. And this is the incidence of 1 in 125,000 or 1 in 1 million women under 55 years. And they develop 4 to 20 days later after vaccination, the cerebrovascular sinus thrombosis. And they also have associated thrombocytopenia. Women less than 30 years, if they have the infection, the second dose can be given. The first dose did not have any problem. Second dose can be given. There is no heparin or a platelet transfusion should be given to these patients. NOACs can be used. Consult hematologist. Rarely can use IVIG for 2 days. So this is one important problem which has brought a lot of fear in the minds of people. And a lot of people from Covishield wanted to shift to Covaxin because they felt that the Covishield vaccine produced this kind of problem. But let me assure you, the incidence is quite less. And these are the patients who probably be taking oral contraceptive pills. And therefore, this could have been potentiated or initiated because of the kind of thrombosis these patients. We have a lot of now dealing with the mutants, the single, double, triple mutants. They cause immune escape, they cause vaccine escapes. They are fast transmissible with low virulence. We have these kinds of virulence. I mean, the CDC classifies them as B1.17 or P1 Brazil, then B1.351 South African, then the American, California, New Zealand, and India is 6.17. And what is shown here is that these are some of the strains which are mutant who do not respond to vaccine very effectively. These are the Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine, BioNTech vaccine, where they don't show any good response to these things. So therefore, we need to know more about it because we have a lot of proteins in this virus. We have the spike protein, we have the envelope protein, we have membrane protein, we have nuclear protein. All of them can mutate, and mutation is a normal phenomenon in RNA virus because the RNA virus survives because of mutation itself. Without mutation, the virus can't survive. So therefore, we need to have a vaccine which covers all possible mutations that can occur in the COVID infection. So the anaphylaxis is one reason we should be careful. In the history of any kind of allergy, do not take the vaccine. And if the elderly patient frailty, you might, but there's no contraindication. A lot of people ask me questions about they're taking aspirin and the blood thinner, they should go vaccine. They can, they no need to stop aspirin. Only those patients who are taking anticoagulants, if their INR is more than 3, maybe they have to stop a drug for 1 day and then can go for vaccine. All of the medications can be continued. And patients with comorbid conditions like diabetes, patients of malignancies, patients of transplant should take vaccination. There are a lot of kind of non-vaccinators, and there's a lot of move against the vaccine. But I think it's very unfortunate. Unless you vaccine 70% of the population, you do not really get the benefit. That brings me to Newton's fourth law of motion. It says for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction plus social media overreaction. The social media is the one which has confused the people large. They keep on talking about the science without having proper knowledge and creating a lot of confusion in the minds of people. I think the social media should restrict themselves to other news, but do not meddle with the medical aspects of the disease. So many patients ask me, is the vaccine a foolproof? Can it be 100% safe? It's like people wish you a happy married life at the time of the marriage. Is it similar? Is it true? And people in India cannot have social distancing. It never works in India. You can see this man peeping inside the glass to take a ticket for some of these program that is there. So therefore, the vaccine is only way forward. And if you vaccinate 70% of your population, you can get rid of the disease. With that, I stop my presentation and finish my talk. Paramita, if you're there, or Dr. Sandeep ji, we can have the question and session. If
Yeah,
there are any questions.
thank you, sir, for covering all the aspects of management and diagnosis of COVID-19. You have touched upon the history. We started with the history, then entered into the symptoms of COVID-19, then clinical course of COVID-19 in pregnancy, then extrapulmonary manifestations of COVID-19. You have also touched upon the chest X-ray, CT abnormalities, talked about the scoring system, because today's scenario is that anybody is sending the patients for the CT scans, and you have mentioned very clearly that CT scan scoring value has no utmost value at current scenario. Then you have touched upon the timing of PCR and antigen test, then defining the COVID-19 severity and spectrum. Then you have mentioned very clearly that 80% of the patients are having the mild and the moderate symptoms, that they don't need any hospitalization. Only 2 to 5% need the respiratory assistance. The predictors of mortality among COVID-19, you have talked about that positive hospitalized patients we have touched, and talked about the second wave and COVID-19 appropriate behavior. Then you entered into the management, where you have touched upon the non-pharmacological preventive measures, interventions, then non-therapeutic management of mild COVID cases, then key therapeutic classes, then the drug therapy, then the IDSA recommendation, and you touched upon various trials like Solidarity trial, then today's scenario, ivermectin, dexamethasone, FabiFlu, budesonide, all those things you have touched, because these are the things which are being people are taking anyhow. Then you have talked about the recovery trial, then passive immunization, tocilizumab, then COVID symptoms and COVID PCR guidelines. Then you have touched upon virtuous trial in COVID-19. And I like this article which your colleague has posted, that frying pan into the fire, that is post COVID-19 and mucormycosis, which has created a big havoc, and it has created as an other epidemic now, and the various states have already declared it. You have talked that we have to take the bitter with the sweet, and then you touched upon the reinfection, how to manage post-COVID and fatigue and stress disorder. This is the common thing which is coming up very soon now, and a lot of people are asking about this. You'd have at the last, you have talked about the COVID vaccination scenario and flattening the IQ curve, and then you have talked about the Indian landscape of COVID-19, various mutants, and last is Newton's fourth law, in which you have talked about social media overreaction. So I'll stop here. I think a lot of questions are there in the chat box. I think very beautiful slides, updated information, I can say, and very useful for all the delegates. I think you have put immense efforts in creation of this particular presentation. Over to you, sir, in the question answer in the chat box. There is a colleague who has mentioned that only 2% of Indian population vaccinated. Is it? No, I think, sir, there are total 21 crore people who have been vaccinated. So
yeah, 10%. But we are ahead of Japan. Japan is just 4%. Japan waited till almost end of February. Almost in the first week of March, Japan started, because they were worried about the utility of the vaccine for the variant strain. So they took a long time. They are now hit by fourth wave, and the Olympic is all off. So Japan suffered very heavily because of the inaction. And therefore, I think we should learn lesson from this, because if you act early, probably I think you will save a lot of lives of the people.
There is a query from one doctor that many of our post-COVID patients return with the history of recurrent and remittent fever and headache persistent for more than 1 month after declared cured and weaned off from steroids. How to approach such cases?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question and very, very practical question. What I should tell them is that the patient, after they recover from COVID infection, and because of the use of the steroids, there are a lot of immune suppression created in these patients. So reactivation of tuberculosis is what I've been seeing off late in these patients. I remember these patients taking the steroid treatment almost for a month, and they kept on tapering at a very slow pace because they're worried about what is so-called as the cytokine storm. Remember, if your chest is clear, if your respiratory system is normal, respiratory rate is normal, your oxygen levels are okay, there is no need to fear about cytokine storm, because cytokine storm is not like septic shock that you see in the ICU patient following infections. This is restricted to lungs. So therefore, if the lungs are not flooded, if the respiratory rate is normal, not to worry about it at all. Always think of the infection which is initiated by the unscrupulous use of steroids. And one thing one should rule out the possible tuberculosis infection, because I feel that is at least that is 4 patients I've seen recently who have got the exacerbation of the heel tuberculosis in the past. And to remind you that once you take treatment for tuberculosis, the tubercle bacilli remain dormant in that area, and you giving steroids will open up the gates for this bacteria again to cause fresh invasion.
Thank you, sir. Suspended aerosol in air, how long it remains in the environment and how?
Yeah, this is also a question which is asked by many times. If it is open air, then there is no question, blown off. But if you're in a closed environment, for example, in the pub, in the wedding hall, because a lot of patients got infection in the wedding hall, though number of people are just 40, 50 restricted, but one patient infected can infect everyone because it's a closed environment. So therefore, if it remains suspended in the air, and if it's the air cool system, in air conditioning, then the chances of it remaining in the suspended air for at least 6 to 8 hours. So if you remain there in the wedding hall for more than half an hour, the chance of you getting infections are pretty high. So therefore, remember that do not go to the wedding halls or any gathering which is air conditioned. It should be all open. If it's an open air, then nothing happens. You can jolly well go there. It does not cause any problem.
Thank you, sir. If only sore throat is present in the patient but no other symptoms even after 15 days, which test should you suggest to diagnose COVID-19?
Of course, the gold standard test, of course, is the RT-PCR, but now it's 15 days over at this point of time that your test for the either antigen or the RT-PCR will be negative. In that case, you can do antibodies. Again, I'm telling you that if you want to establish diagnosis, but 15 days later, when the patient otherwise is not having any symptoms, there's no need to really put a label of the case of COVID. But if you really want to do it for the academic purpose, then you can do the antibody test. If the antibody test is positive, then you can say this patient probably suffered from COVID infection, and that sore throat can remain for most of these symptoms remain. I told you about long haulers. Patients have chest pain, sore throat, breathlessness, fatigue, exhaustion that can remain for 2 to 3 months. If there is nothing obvious in this patient, just encourage the patient. Do not initiate any medication except symptomatic treatment. You mentioned about salt gargle. I think that's the best way to do this treatment, only local symptomatic treatment.
Can you explain the difference between the tightness of a throat and the sore throat, and what treatment do you advise for tightness of throat?
Yeah, the tightness of throat actually is a symptom which patient tells us that this is what the patient tells us. And this symptom can be sometimes suggestive of the non-infectious disease, especially, for example, patient has a gastric reflux disorder, or the patient has ischemic heart disease. All those patients complains about tightness of the chest, tightness in the throat. Sometimes they feel the upper breath and lower breath are getting away from each other. These are very funny symptoms the patient tells us. And more often than not, the patient does not complain of the chest pain, because ischemic heart disease, normally we say always has chest pain. So remember, those are the non-infectious causes. But if you have a sore throat, if you open the patient's mouth, just see if there are lesions on the pharynx and the tonsils. If that's inflamed and the patient is extremely painful situation, don't forget to think of herpes simplex. I've seen recently, the patient was sent to me as a case of mucormycosis. When I looked at the throat, it was a red hot lesion, and on the biopsy proved to be the herpes simplex infection, which can be again opportunity infection. I also seen a patient histoplasmosis presenting similarly with kind of sore throat. So all that itches in the throat need not be patient having either a COVID or a mucormycosis. It could be some other virus also, or histoplasmosis, again, another kind of fungal infection.
How many days on average sequelae can persist, cough and anosmia?
If it's actual infection that COVID actually has, should not persist more than 2 weeks. And those patients who recover from COVID can continue to have those symptoms are those patients who are long haulers, where you examine these patients, you don't find anything abnormality. The chest, sounds are clear, patient normal respiratory rate, and his oxygen tension is normal. I think don't take tension of these patients.
A lot of colleagues have appreciated this session, sir. One is asking that how to sanitize the mobile phone.
I think there are a lot of devices available. All the medical representatives use the device where you put it on, switch on. They have the ultraviolet rays. The ultraviolet rays has A waves, B wave, and C waves. The ultraviolet C wave is supposed to be a disinfectant. B wave is supposed to give you vitamin D on your skin when you're exposed to sun air. And A wave is extremely toxic, that gives you skin burns. So this is the ultraviolet C waves, a lot of ultraviolet C lamps, which have been used to disinfect your mobile. The chemicals can also be used, but these chemicals also destroy your mobile phone. I had to change my mobile phone because my speaker got clogged with that particular disinfectant. So use those devices which are very safe, very effective. Or if you're getting the sunlight in your room, keep your mobile phone in sunlight for at least 20 minutes. That is sufficient.
And what is the view about ACEI and ARB if the person is speaking?
AC?
EI, I think. ACEI and ARB.
I don't know what the meaning of
What
that.
the meaning? I don't know. What is the view about ACEI and ARB of the person? I don't know.
I also don't know.
Okay. Otherwise,
We'll pass that question.
Yeah. Mild disease with only one parameter, critical, say only D dimer is more than 2 times, but CBC, CRP is normal. Should we admit these patients or not?
No, I think no. Do not pay attention. I was telling you repeatedly, all the clinicians when I'm talking to them, please do not be very, functional about using these tests repeatedly, making the patient pay. Laboratories are overloaded. One test does not mean the patient has a problem. Of course, I have recently seen a patient who had a persistent abnormal elevation of the D dimer, and then he also had a symptom of leg pain. And when we did a Doppler, we could find a clot there. D dimer tells you there's some clot somewhere else, and the COVID infection is known to have clots. So therefore, if there's nothing major, for example, no leg pains, no pulmonary embolism, I think you can just wait and watch.
Is the lymphopenia the reason for mucormycosis?
No, I think it is the infection produced by the dysglycemia, because diabetes has to be there, or there's immunocompromised state. Very rarely you can see patients who are on immunosuppression. Those can have, and of course the ketosis. Keto is the only parasite or a fungus which can grow in the acid medium. So kind of acidosis should be there, because when the glucose is so much, the tissues can't utilize the glucose. So therefore they break the fat. And this broken fat is converted to ketone bodies. So ketosis should be there for a fungal growth.
Any specific tests, sir, to measure the effectiveness of vaccine?
I think one should not do antibodies, because a lot of doctors now, after taking 2 vaccines, go for the antibody test. And they said my IgG, my IgM levels are grown up, so I got adequate kind of a support of vaccine. I think if you just follow your patients well, if they have no symptoms, I think leave it alone. Don't do anything else. It gives you protection. As per the trial, the Covishield vaccine is 71% and Covaxin is 81%. That means there is efficacy to the tune of 81%. So it's likely that even if you get infection, it will be a very mild infection. So there are unfortunate cases from Delhi where a doctor who took all the vaccines still succumbed to Covishield or the COVID virus, but that is a rare kind of instance.
There was a study supporting the initiating budesonide nebulization. Nebulization in the early stage of mild COVID cases.
Yeah. I showed that case. I showed that.
So
I showed that in it.
They want to know something more on this. Can you throw some more light on the same?
Yeah, I think this is very important, because when you do not want to defer steroid, and the patient is 50 years plus, has diabetes, hypertension, comorbid conditions, the best thing to help the patients to overcome the infection is using the topical steroids, or what is called as the inhaled steroids. The dose is pretty small, does not produce any systemic problems, does not cause high sugar, does not block the pituitary hypothalamic axis, adrenal axis. So therefore it is quite safe and quite effective. And it is shown that the results are pretty high. I think it's catching up, and a lot of more studies are being now tried and people are working on it. I think it should be a good game changer where you can avoid steroids.
Can sputum sample taken from AFP microscopy be used for RT-PCR or RAT? Or RAT?
I don't know, because the collection has to be rapidly, because the moment you collect the sample from that, it has to be kept in a solution to separate the virus. So that has to be done very specifically for the virus. So the solution is specified. So you can't do that. That is a Ziel-Nielsen technique that's different. No, you can't.
Okay. If D-dimer is more than 2 times even after 17 days, should we admit this patient or can give Epiaxmin orally at home?
I think the anticoagulant may be considered if you feel that there is history of the patient having breathlessness, or the evidence that patient has chest pain or ECG abnormality, suggesting there's some evidence of thromboembolic episode. Then you're justified in giving the anticoagulants. Just because one test is high doesn't mean that the patient requires this therapy. It's very important. The thromboprophylaxis by the American Association of Hematologists has very clearly said that one sparrow does not make summer.
Thank you, sir. Is there any contraindication for vaccination with person having history of multiple drug allergy? And also, what is the choice of medicine?
Yeah, if there is allergy to any vaccine, or a lot of vaccines use the suspension material to keep it stable. The ethanol is one which can be used in some of the vaccines, especially the Covishield. And some people have a severe allergic reaction to these. I think these are the people we should not take vaccine. Those are the people who have such kind of allergic reaction, because they can be very serious allergic. There can be manifest like transverse myelitis, facial paralysis. All these are various manifestations of immune reaction to vaccine. They should not. They should practice mask, hand washing, keeping away. But the other members in the house should be vaccinated. So they will not give infection to this man. So that is important.
How far it is true, sir, that use of high dose of vitamin C improve patient outcome? Do you recommend this thing? How far?
Actually, there's no evidence. There's one study which is done, which is called an OLLY study, where they used a high dose of vitamin C intravenously in the hospitalized patient, and showed the reduction of incidence of influenza virus infection, not vaccine, infection. And therefore, this is the one which is extrapolated for the COVID infection, and said that the viral infection can be reduced. Personally, there's no data.
Okay. Once patient recovered, how long he or she can be infective to others?
The study which was done from Wuhan looked at the viral shedding of the patients after discharge from hospital. And those studies are old studies, of course. They're done in the month of somewhere last year, Jan, Feb. And those studies said till 22 days, the patient kept on shedding the virus. It's possible that the virus they shed was a dead virus, but all the same, the patient kept on shedding the virus for 22 days after he's recovered completely from COVID infection.
How would mutations post-vaccination will affect the nature of illness? And shall we anticipate more severe forms?
No. Well, there is what we said, that there is 80% efficacy of the vaccine when you use Covishield, 70%, 80% when you use Covaxin. What does it mean? That means that the 80% of the patient will be protected from the infection. 20% might get infection. Even if you get infection, the infection or infectivity is quite less. So the patient might have mild infection, you might get cold cough or something like that, but then it is going to be self-limiting. There will be no death, no hospitalization once you take vaccination. Therefore, everyone must take the vaccine and take whichever vaccine is available. Don't wait for the next vaccine or this vaccine.
Thanks. So, a patient who is RT-PCR positive and complains of chest tightness with normal saturation on day 6, do we have to take chest CT thorax?
Yeah, if there is a suggestion that there is the symptoms are probably because of COVID, then you can use it for diagnostic purposes, not from therapy point of view. You can just stage the patient's disease, because the CT scan picture becomes positive after 6 days of infection of the first symptoms. You can do it because it's quite sensitive, but it's only for the purpose of diagnosis. What is the cause of the chest tightness of this patient? When the patient is absolutely other symptom free and has a good saturation, there is no role of using remdesivir in this patient. Remdesivir very narrow window, patients within first 10 days with low oxygen saturation is the indication for using remdesivir.
Are cough suppressants recommended for cough in long haulers?
Yeah, you can. Then I think I'm talking about the bromhexine,
Yeah.
which also has the action on the transmembrane protein TMPRSS2, and therefore can have some kind of, kind of a decrease in the progression or the aggression of the disease. So yes, you can. The symptom treatment, yes, you can.
Is the virus directly acting as immunosuppressant?
No, actually, it is stimulating the immune system. It's stimulating in the wrong way because it is going to initiate the symptoms. I do not know what will happen with this virus in those patients who are immunocompromised. For example, those patients of HIV infection, those patients who are high dose of steroids, they might get flooded with this kind of virus. I do not know how they'll present with, but this is going to initiate the immune response.
Is the mucormycosis seen in non-diabetic and children too?
Children, I don't know. In type 1 diabetes, ketoacidosis is possible, but I have not seen one, but it is possible. But usually it's adult who get this. All of us keep on inhaling. These spores are there all over. When I'm sitting in this room, I'm also inhaling mucor. But that you require that medium, the seed and soil carry. You require diabetes, you require ketoacidosis, you get hyperglycemia, you get immune compromised status, and those patients will only get the infection.
Post-COVID investigation recommended till 30 days, and how to avoid fibrosis in lung, and what to do if patient still getting cough during night after discharge.
Yes, if the patient continues to have symptoms and you're sure it is purely because of respiratory disease, then you can give symptomatic treatment. And you can also do what is called pulmonary physiotherapy, where improve the capacity of the lungs by doing exercise. So therefore the effort tolerance also improves. But I must tell one thing, Dr. Sandeep,
Yes,
that whatever the patient's illness, how bad the lungs were, no matter how long the patient was ICU, no matter how long the patient was ventilator, no matter how much oxygen was given to him, these patients will do well.
True.
There's a light at the end of the tunnel. And therefore, I feel if you can encourage them, give them a good exercise, they will not remain with the residual fibrosis. And that pirfenidone, which was used a drug for interstitial lung disease, more people use it, but it's not recommended. Nothing is recommended except good pulmonary physiotherapy. You can engage a good physiotherapist, do good exercise of the lung, improve your vital capacity, you will do well.
Last two questions. If a patient is having history of allergy to paracetamol, what is the choice of management of fever?
You can use other drugs. For example, the NSAIDs have come in a big way. I feel that naproxen is a drug which is really, I mean, at some centers they've tried naproxen, and this is the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, which has shown a prolonged effect on the defervescence of fever, headaches, and all symptoms. And these patients did well over long term. And they were the one who symptomatic did well and therefore did not go to doctor very frequently. And therefore doctor did not use steroids. So that's one reason where I feel that if the patient doesn't want to take paracetamol or has a reaction to paracetamol, which is unusual, but can occur, anything can occur anywhere, we can use the NSAIDs.
Which vaccine is advisable for kids less than 18 years?
So far, there's no data below 18 years. People are working on it. We have no answer. Now, vaccine is only available beyond 18 years of age.
So that's all, sir. I think you have covered all the queries and the questions. And I think on behalf of Eco India, I'm really thankful to you for elaborating this on this particular topic, which is a really a devastating, which is a really a very changeable science on a day-to-day basis, because the moment it started in 2019 in December, and now if you can see in 2021, huge changes have happened in the management, diagnosis, vaccination, and I think the nutshell is vaccination is the nutshell solution, and the countries like Israel, which has already gone with the full vaccination, countries like Britain, countries like Singapore, which has already started achieving a plateau in their cases level. It is only because of the vaccination. I think vaccination is the key nutshell, and our country is also moving very fastly now in the vaccination drive. And I think your municipal corporation of Mumbai was the first who started the drive-in vaccinations drive also, because of your commissioner of the municipal corporation. He started this innovative idea, and now a lot of cities have entered into this vaccination drive, moving vaccination drive-in. So I think on behalf of Eco India, I'm really thankful and for your commitment and the time which you have given to us, and we will try that how we can work together in multiple arenas also. And thank you for giving your precious time to this to all of us, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
But
Thank
before we close, Dr. Sandeep Balla, I will tell you one thing, that whatever I spoke today and whatever the evidence I have shown you may not be valid next time. And you give me next time to speak to me again, I have to make the slides again new ones, because I think the science is changing so much. And what is today's concept is tomorrow's no more a concept. So that is the thing. And as you emphasized, really, the use of vaccine is the only solution to get out of the pandemic. So that is the only solution.
Sure, sir. Thank you, sir. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Good night.
Good
Yes. Deepaji, thank you very much. Paramita, thank you very much for this.
She is there.
Yes,
Just a formal closure of the
I
session.
have to speak to in Bengali quite often.
Okay. Yeah, just giving a formal closure to the session. Thank you to Dr. Naglur for a detailed and informative session. Thank you, Dr. Bhalla, to moderate the session and take the questions. I hope this is benefited and helpful for our participants. For the participants, there's a feedback link in the chat box. Please fill in the feedback and let us know how we can improve better. I have also sent the link for YouTube channel of Eco India, where the recording of all the sessions are uploaded, and hopefully we'll upload the session also by tonight. Our next session of the COVID-19 educational series is scheduled on Monday, 31st May, at 6 p.m. by Dr. Sangeeta Goswami, India's leading counseling psychologist and president of Mind India. And the topic will be enhancing emotional well-being, self-compassion. Please do register yourself for this session. Thank you all for your participation. Have a wonderful evening ahead. Stay safe.
Okay, before we close, one question which is interesting. Dr. Ballaji, with your permission, just one minute.
Please, sir.
This is saying that agencies are reporting COVID as a lab made. Is it true? I think this is that Nicholas Wade's paper, who's actually a science writer, which came about 2 weeks ago. I think you must have read that paper. It's an extensive paper. And he has given evidences that it is certainly from a lab, which is leaked from a lab. And because we say it's fallen from the bat, because these bats are 1,500 kilometers away from Wuhan, number one. And that time, these bats are hibernating. So the theory that it has come from bat this is all conjectural. But somebody has raised this question. That's possible. Yes, it is possible. Let's see whether time will tell us exactly what is the correct answer.
Just to add on this, sir, WHO has again pushed up this agenda to reinvestigate the things that if you see that it was there in last week only, and they are pitching into to reinvestigate.
Yeah, 24th May to be very precise. Just 5 days ago. 5 days ago.
That's what I'm saying last week only, that we have pushed this agenda. So I think time will tell us the real story, what the thing is. But devastating part is that we have lost so many human lives. We pray for all of them and for their families also, because
life, livelihood, job, everything people are lost.
This is a very tragic moment, and let us pray for goodness for everybody in times to come. So thank you on behalf of Eco India, sir, and thank you for giving us this opportunity.
Thank you.